When Lost in Space first aired in 1965, it was something very different from what many people remember today. The first season, filmed in black and white, had a very different tone. There was a sense of danger, a seriousness to the story, and at times, it was a little disturbing. But after that first season, something changed. By the time the series came back in season 2, Lost in Space had changed forever. Now, if you like classic TV, movies, and nostalgia, you're going to love it here at Rerun Zone. So like, share, subscribe, and become a channel member. Now, let's get into it. Fantasy, sci-fi, horror, Rerun Zone. I was 11 when I watched the first season of Lost in Space, and it was truly magical. The first time I heard about the series was a preview on a local Philadelphia TV station. It was on a children's show, the Gene London Show, where he showed several clips. One I distinctly remember was a shot of the Jupiter 2 crash landing on an alien planet with the crew in their suspended animation tubes. I didn't care if it was in black and white, as we only had a black and white TV set in 1965. When the show finally premiered in September of that year, I was glued to the TV set, and it was everything I had hoped for. I'd been reading the Space Family Robinson comic books by Gold Key, and I couldn't wait to see the real-life adventures of the Robinson family. Even though it wasn't exactly like the comic, I loved every minute of it. The first 5 episodes were classic, with the Robinsons struggling just to stay alive on an alien world, where they were threatened with freezing to death, burning to death, drowning in an inland sea, and then attacked by a literal alien giant. Wow. And of course, there was Dr. Smith, who was a true villain in those episodes. As the season went on, we had the great 2-part episode with guest star Michael Rennie, called The Keeper, War of the Robots with Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet, and Return from Outer Space, where Will finds himself back on Earth. Not every episode was of the highest quality, but all in all, a pretty fine season. By the time the second season of Lost in Space arrived, the show was now in full color. Along with that came something else, something unexpected. The character of Dr. Smith, who was once a threat, now began to take on a different role. Less dangerous, more unpredictable, and at times, even comedic. This change wasn't happening just on Lost in Space, though. The whole television landscape was beginning to shift. The success of Batman in 1966, by leaning into a campy, lighter, and more exaggerated tone, did not go unnoticed by the networks. And as that shift took hold, Lost in Space began to change with it. Let's take a look at the difference. In that first season, Lost in Space was way closer to traditional science fiction. Younger people may only know about the campy, color seasons, but for those of us who grew up with the show, the difference was huge. The stories would center on the Robinsons' survival, the family's isolation, and the uncertainty of being stranded on an alien world so far from home. There were moments of danger, strange encounters, and situations that didn't always have easy answers. And the Robinson family was at the center of it all. Each member had a role to play, each one contributing to the idea that this was a family just trying to survive, not just an adventure to be enjoyed. Even the robot felt more like just a part of that world instead of the focus of it. And then there was Dr. Smith. In those early episodes, he was something very, very different from what he later became. Not just a nuisance, not just comic relief, but a genuine threat. Self-serving, manipulative, and often the cause of the dangers that the family had to face. There was a tension in his presence, a sense that he would make an already difficult situation even worse. In fact, it was Dr. Smith's own actions in the very beginning, sabotaging the Jupiter 2 before launch, that set the entire mission off course in the first place. And then, in Episode 3, Island in the Sky, he sends the robot out to eliminate all non-essential personnel, so he can escape by himself from the planet. It sets up a situation where an isolated Will Robinson could be killed by his future best friend. Even after that, his decisions would make an already dangerous situation far worse. There were moments where his fear, or his desire to protect himself, led him to put the rest of the family at risk, sometimes deliberately, sometimes without fully considering the consequences. As the show moved into its second season, things began to change. And the biggest change was in the storytelling. Some of it had to do with Jonathan Harris himself. In early season 1, Dr. Smith is written as a straight villain, a cold, competent spy who sabotages the Jupiter 2, physically attacks a guard, and openly plots to kill the Robinsons. The character was conceived as a short-term antagonist who'd be written out of the show, not as the show's long-term focus. Harris quickly realized that if Smith stayed a one-note heavy, he was expendable, so he started rewriting and ad-libbing his own lines, dialing up the vanity, the insults, and the cowardice that became his trademarks. He stopped seriously trying to kill the family and leaned into comic bits with Will and the robot. The network also wanted a more family-friendly, broadly appealing tone, as Lost in Space was finding its audience. That meant softening Smith's murderous saboteur into something kids could laugh at instead of fear. There was also the mid-60s camp craze, started by the highly successful Batman TV series. It pushed Irwin Allen to emphasize colorful humor and fantasy plots over straight-up sci-fi adventure. And with the show's move to color, it brought a different energy to the series. Dr. Smith was now more theatrical, more exaggerated, and way more humorous. His interactions with the robot, once tense and unpredictable, gradually became the center of most of the episodes. The dynamic had shifted from conflict to comedy. And audiences loved it for the most part. Dr. Smith became more memorable, more recognizable, and in many ways more entertaining to a general audience. Shows like Batman proved that audiences wanted a lighter, more playful tone, even in stories that might once have been taken more seriously. As that trend took hold, Lost in Space followed it and moved away from its serious sci-fi approach. The focus of the show shifted away from the quieter, more reflective moments of the first season and towards something that was broader, and from the network's perspective, a little easier to watch from week to week. It wasn't a sudden change, but over time, it became clear that the show was heading in a different direction. By the time the series reached its third season, even the show itself seemed to know that something was lost along the way. By the time Lost in Space reached its third season, there was a sense that the show had drifted, further from its premise than anyone ever expected. The lighter tone, the exaggerated characters, the outlandish situations had found an audience, but not the same audience the show started with. For anyone who'd connected with those earlier episodes, something about the show now felt very different. By the third season, the broader trend in television was starting to shift again. The camp style that had come on like gangbusters was starting to lose its appeal. Somewhere along the way, Lost in Space recognized that fact. So in the third season, there was an attempt to move back towards something more adventurous and family-oriented. The setting shifted again, putting the Robinson family back into space instead of stranded on just one planet. The stories themselves started to go back toward adventure, exploration, and the unknown, like they were in the first season. It also brought more of the Robinson family into the stories, as they, at times, had been pushed to the background. They started to take on a more central role again. Their interactions, decision, and sense of purpose started to feel more like the foundation of the show again, instead of something secondary to it. Dr. Smith, still very much a part of the series, remained a larger-than-life presence, but no longer carried quite the same weight as before. It wasn't a complete return to the tone of the first season, and maybe it couldn't have been, but there was a sense that the show was trying to find its balance again. After all, when a show changes direction to try to reach what they believe is a wider audience, it sometimes loses the very magic that made people like it in the first place. There was an expectation that Lost in Space would come back for a fourth season. While filming the last third season episode, the cast and crew were unofficially told that the series had been renewed for a fourth season. Irwin Allen had already ordered new scripts, and at least one was completed, with some people saying that up to 5 scripts were done. A few weeks later, though, when CBS announced its fall schedule, Lost in Space wasn't on it. There was no official explanation, but rising production costs, actor salaries, and the upkeep of the Jupiter 2 were seen as the main reasons. A ratings dip in the third season also caused CBS to ask Irwin Allen for a budget cut of around 15%, which Allen refused to do. So the show finally came to a quiet end, without the crew of the Jupiter 2 ever finding their way back home. Looking back on it now, Lost in Space feels like more than just a single series. It was a show that changed along with the time it was made in. What started out as one thing ended up as something totally different. It went from a more traditional science fiction adventure series to straight comedy with over-the-top fantasy elements and just a touch of adventure here and there. It became something broader and more colorful for sure, as it tried to keep in step with what television audiences seemed to want at that moment in time. In many ways, that change made the show more accessible to a wider audience, and for many viewers, that's the version of Lost in Space that they remember the most. But for others, the original viewers, there's still something about that epic first season black and white run that feels like a different show completely. And maybe that's why people remember Lost in Space in different ways. Not because one version replaced the other, but because both of them existed at the same time, just at different points along the way. It's a reminder that shows aren't always built to stay the same. They shift, they adapt. They sometimes follow the audience. And sometimes they try to find their way back to what made them great in the first place. In the case of Lost in Space, that journey is just as memorable as the destination. Now, if you like classic TV, movies, and nostalgia, you're going to love it here at Rerun Zone. So like, share, subscribe, and become a channel member. It helps me to keep making these videos about the classics so they don't fade into distant memory. As always, thanks for watching. This is Rich from Rerun Zone. I'll see you next time, and have a good night.